Okay, so great. We're going to get started. Welcome to this webinar on diversity and representativeness in real-world data sources. This webinar is co-hosted by the National Health Council, the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and Academy Health. My name is Dr. Lisa Simpson, and I am President and CEO at Academy Health. And I also serve as treasurer on the National Health Council's board of directors. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping details. Next slide, please. So like many other sessions, this is in Zoom and there's some basic orientation, but importantly, this webinar is being recorded and archived on the National Health Council's website in case you miss some important parts or you're not able to attend all of it, you can come back to it. You can find this webinar on the website at the same location where you registered. All participants are automatically muted. We will have time at the end for Q&A, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A pod on your Zoom, at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And hopefully after 15 months into this virtual life, you're pretty familiar with where to find that. Now this webinar, next slide, please. Now, this webinar is part of a PCORI-funded training series for the patient community on real-world data and real-world evidence. And we've had a very rich series of presenters and discussions during the course of this program. This training would not have been possible, however, without this fantastic advisory board that you see listed here. And we are very grateful and extend our thanks to the advisory board members. Next slide, please. Now, today's webinar is the last one in the series. And as I alluded to already, we had a very rich program of various webinars. And again, you can go to the NHC's Real World Evidence Classroom to check out the website, to watch all these recordings, to review the infographics, as well as access, importantly, plain language glossary. So yes, I definitely need to listen to some of these because they've got great speakers. Next slide, please. Now, the objective of this training series is on real-world data. And here you see the definition that real-world data is widely used to produce evidence and algorithms to guide healthcare delivery. In other words, the care that you and I get as patients in healthcare. And many of us, even though we have titles and jobs, we also have lives as patients. And I personally am a cancer survivor, having celebrated 20 years just past December. So really understanding the evidence and how it's used and through algorithms and clinical decision-making to inform the choices we are offered or not is really critical. And there's growing recognition that researchers must carefully consider the potential for the underlying data and researcher bias, which can unintentionally perpetuate racial and gender disparities. Now, our speakers, the speakers in the series, including today myself and my colleague, are discussing these issues and provide examples of how these issues can affect research and eventually the quality of care that we each receive. Next slide, please. So here we are. I don't look like that right now. I need to update that photo. And Ziad, you'll see in a few minutes, has got a bit wilder hair. So, you know, what's the pandemic done to us? But I want to first introduce him, and I'll say a little bit about myself as well. And then I have a couple of remarks, and then we'll dive into Ziad's presentation. So my background, I am a pediatrician by training and a child health services researcher by trade. And I've been at Academy Health now for 10 years. Ziad is also a physician, but he is still in practice. He's an emergency doctor, and he still gets away as often as he can to a hospital in rural Arizona to do what he loves, and that is to work in the ER. But these days, Ziad spends most of his time doing research and teaching at UC Berkeley. Now, inspired by his clinical work, he builds machine learning algorithms that help doctors make better decisions. He also studies where and when algorithms can go wrong, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, and how they can scale up racial bias and how to fix that. He has received many awards for his work from the National Academy of Medicine, the American Society of Health Economists, the NIH, medical societies, and publishes in a wide range of journals, some names you might know, like Science and the New England Journal of Medicine, or another one that I was not familiar with is computer science conferences like NeurIPS or NeurIPS. I don't even know how to pronounce it. And most importantly, though, is how influential his work is and continues to be. And it's frequently cited in the public debate about algorithms, as well as federal and state regulatory guidance to industry. So that is my formal job as the first part of my formal job as your moderator and welcomer. And if I could have the next slide, please. So I want to tell you, again, we're really delighted that this session is focusing on the question of diversity and how we address diversity in our data and our evidence, and therefore in our clinical decision-making and the choices that we have as patients and clinicians. And I want to tell you a little bit about what Academy Health is doing on this. Next slide, please. So Academy Health, if you're not familiar with us, we are the National Organization for Health Services Research and Policy. And our mission, as you see here, is to improve health and healthcare for all by advancing evidence to inform policy and practice. Next slide, please. And in responding to the pandemic and the events of last year, we established 3 cross-cutting priorities, and one of those is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a very important priority for us, so I'm particularly pleased to be able to join you today. Next slide, please. To address diversity, equity, and inclusion within health services research, which again serves as the basis for decision-making, we have chosen a framework where we look at modeling, we assess ourselves, and we do a number of activities. We lead, working with our partners, the National Health Council and many other organizations, and we influence. How do we help to facilitate changes in the broader community? And part of that is education. And so this conference and this session certainly supports that. Next slide, please. We also, it's part of a broader commitment and a recognition that the field of health services research really needs to, while it is an amazing field, and I'm very proud to count myself a member, we need to step up and do even better. And for us to address some of those diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges, as well as others, we have to really have a cohesive vision. We have to make sure we're asking the right questions, questions driven by patients, by stakeholders. We have to involve the right people and the partners, patients, communities, other health system stakeholders, and policymakers to make sure we're asking and answering relevant questions. And importantly, in the focus of today is using the right data and methods and keeping our toolkit and our toolbox of research up to date as we learn more about the potential and pitfalls of these new data sources and algorithms. And then as we communicate our findings, we really have to partner and make sure we're using the right messengers and the right messages. And finally, underlying all of that is that we're addressing the incentives that drive the behavior of all of us in this healthcare ecosystem. Next slide, please. I want to mention that we are focused. One example of our work in diversity is really working across sectors to bring folks together to really understand what it means to have an inclusive community and to welcome all and to respect and elevate and value all perspectives. Next slide, please. And then finally, in closing, before I now open it up to Ziad, we are doing a number of related activities. They are listed here. This will be in your slide deck. But as you'll see, there are a number of different activities: thought leadership, grant making, responsible use is very important, and then showcasing new data. And if you're interested in any of these, I welcome a question during the Q&A period, or you can contact me afterwards through your colleagues at the NHC. So with that, I want to turn to the next slide or hand it over. I think, do we have a transition slide or do I just hand it over to Ziad? Hey, it's Ziad's turn. Fantastic. So Dr. Obermeyer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simpson. And yes, as you noted, my hair has gotten a little wilder, and it's early in California. It's my first Zoom of the day, so it's nice to have an opportunity to check how it's doing on camera. So I really appreciate the chance to be with you today and talk about diversity and equity and representativeness in the data sets that we use to generate real world evidence. And I thought I would share with you a couple of lessons that I learned from what might be an unlikely place to learn about how to do better in terms of equity and diversity, which is from my work on building and evaluating algorithms. Now, algorithms are typically thought of as a place where you can at least learn what goes wrong, but I've also learned a lot about what goes right and how we use data for good rather than for reinforcing some of the inequalities that that we worry about. So the topic for today is diversity and representativeness in real world data. And I think that this does a lot of work for us under normal circumstances to avoid bias. So we rely a lot on looking at metrics of our data set. There we go. Like representation of underserved groups. So we think about, is my data set diverse enough? Do I have enough members of minority or underserved groups? For algorithms, we think a lot about when the algorithm is prioritizing certain groups of people, are those groups diverse enough? And what I've learned from my work is that that way of thinking, those simple heuristics, can actually be very, very misleading. And so today I want to tell you about two cases where diversity is actually not enough. So we can look and we can be falsely reassured by the diversity of our data set when in fact those data sets contain an enormous amount of bias. And so relying on just comparing the number of, for example, Black patients in the data set to the base rate is actually going to be very misleading in ways that I'll try to convince you over the next few minutes. The lesson that I've learned, and I think the thing that I would like anyone who's watching to take away, is that it's of course important to check for diversity and representation in the data set, but that is not enough, and that we actually need to focus on one particular part of the data set in addition to that, which is what is the outcome variable that I am using? What is the clinical outcome I care about? What is the label that I'm training my algorithm to predict if you're training an algorithm? And that is going to be, at least in my work, something that's emerged as a really critical step for ensuring that what we're doing with the data is equitable. So I want to start with one case study of two that I'll tell you about briefly, which is about pain. So as the opiate pandemic has shown, there are just these enormous levels of pain in society, but that pain is not equally distributed. So if you look at surveys of patients about how often they've experienced severe pain in the past few days, rates among Black and self-identified Hispanic patients are twice as high as among white patients. You see similar gradients by income and by education. Now, there's an obvious seeming explanation for this, which is that these underserved groups actually just have higher prevalence of things that hurt, and that's why they report so much more pain. And so that's true to some extent, because we can look at the rates of, for example, knee arthritis among people reporting knee pain, and we do find some gradients, but that doesn't seem to be the whole story. So there's a mystery in this literature, which is that even when we take that severity difference into account, so for example, we look at two patients whose x-rays look exactly the same to a radiologist, and compare their pain scores, what we find is that Black patients, lower income patients, lower education patients still report higher average levels of pain, even when you've taken that severity based on the x-ray into account. So that's a mystery in the literature. And largely speaking, the literature has dealt with this by saying, well, we've looked at the knee, and we haven't found the source of the pain there. So if it's not in their knees, then maybe it's somewhere else. Maybe it's in their heads. And this is not meant at all as a pejorative statement. There's a lot of really excellent research showing that stress makes the same stimulus more painful, that anxiety and depression can often be expressed as physical pain, that given the many other burdens that people experience in their life when they are Black or poor, they just have less mental resources to cope with pain. Alternatively, doctors could be treating these patients differently and giving them less access to things that help them with their pain. But whatever it is, it's not in their knee. So I just want to play this out very concretely in a scenario where, imagine yourself as a doctor and a patient comes in reporting pain in their knee. We're going to be talking about the knee today. And you send them for an x-ray to evaluate whether they might have arthritis, which is the most common cause of knee pain. And if we take this literature seriously, what we'd find is that if that patient is Black, it's more likely that that x-ray is going to come back looking pretty good. So the radiologist is going to say, well, the pain doesn't appear to be coming from arthritis or anything else that I can see in the knee. And what that's going to cause you to do as the doctor is to refer that patient to non-knee based treatments. So you might refer them to a therapist rather than an orthopedist. Notice that everything I've told you so far depends a lot on what we mean by disease severity. I told you that patients with the same severity of arthritis on their knee are going to report different levels of pain based on race. But how do we measure that severity? That's the critical ingredient in all of this research. This is the current state of the art for measuring severity. It is a radiologist looking at a film and grading how bad the arthritis looks. And the way that radiologists do that is by relying on a clinical grading system that was developed by these two doctors, Drs. Kellgren and Dr. Lawrence, in the 1950s in their studies of coal miners in Lancashire, England. And when you go back and look at those original studies, you'll find no mention of the racial or gender breakdown of the study population because they were all white and male. So that, of course, raises the possibility that we might be missing something, that the radiologist, when looking at the x-ray, might be missing causes of pain that disproportionately affect Black patients because that knowledge was built up in a very specific setting with only specific kinds of patients that are not representative of the patients that doctors see today. Now, the question is, how would we know about that? And so what we did in a paper that we published last year in Nature Medicine is we turned to a perhaps unlikely source, which is an algorithm. So typically what we do when we train algorithms, the standard machine learning playbook is we teach the algorithm to learn from the radiologist. So we show the algorithm a lot of x-rays, and then we ask it to spit back out what a radiologist would say about that x-ray. We took a different approach, which is that we asked the algorithm to learn not from the radiologist, but to learn from the patient. So to actually tell us not what the radiologist would say, see if I can go back, not what the radiologist would say about the patient's knee, but what the patient would say about the patient knee, and use that score that the algorithm generated based on the likelihood that a knee was going to hurt to grade the severity of that disease. So here's what we found. As a baseline, the difference between Black and white patients in our sample was enormous. So no pain on this scale is 100 points and severe pain is 86 points or less. And Black patients are on average 11 points worse than white patients. So they're more than halfway towards severe pain relative to white patients in our sample on average. Now, if we account for the radiologist's grading system, the Kellgren-Lawrence grade, we can account for 9% of that gap. But if we account for the algorithm score, we can account for nearly half of that gap. So the algorithm is explaining an enormous amount of the extra pain that Black patients feel in their knee by looking at their knees and finding things about their knee that the radiologist misses. And we find similar results for low-income patients and lower education patients. Now, this has a really important implication, which is that how do we decide who gets knee replacement surgery? Knee replacements can be transformative for patients. It can get them back on their feet and out of the house and meeting friends instead of staying in the house and unable to care for themselves. But to be qualified for knee surgery under medical guidelines, but also under insurance reimbursement rates, you have to have severe disease in your knee. So now think about what that means. There are a lot of Black patients who are reporting very severe pain, but when the radiologist looks at their knee, it doesn't look that bad. So we did an experiment where we substituted in the algorithm severity score for the radiologist severity score in patients with severe pain. And if we did that and kept the same number of knee surgeries, we would double the fraction of Black patients' knees that were actually eligible for surgery. So this bias has a deep implication for access and for explaining disparities in knee replacement surgeries that have been well known in the literature for a long time. So to summarize, here's what we took away from this episode, is that a key reason that our algorithm was able to see the causes of pain that affect Black patients was because we had a diverse data set with a lot of Black patients. It was 17% Black, it was 38% low income. And when we redid the algorithm, taking out those patients and not letting the algorithm learn from Black patients, that made the algorithm's advantage over the radiologist go away. So clearly diverse data sets are very important for doing this kind of work, but it was not enough, because if we just trained that algorithm to spit back out what the radiologist would have said about that patient's knee, we would have missed this enormous bias built into medical knowledge. So the bias wasn't just a question of there weren't enough Black patients in our data set. The bias was we were training on the wrong outcome. We were looking at what we defined as arthritis, but the definition of arthritis codified in medical knowledge actually was exclusionary and discriminated against Black patients by not representing the things in their knees that hurt. So the lesson here, really focus on that outcome variable and ensure that we're looking at the right clinical outcome. We're asking the patient, not the radiologist. And only then can we tap into this enormous power of having diverse data sets. So here's a second brief case study, also from some of my work on algorithms. And this is about high-risk care management. So as we all know, the health system is full of very complex, high-need patients who also have high costs. And all health systems across the country have dealt with this problem by investing in high-risk care management programs, programs where trained nurses come to your house to do foot checks for diabetic ulcers. They get you primary care appointments. They set aside slots for you. They do whatever you need to nip these kinds of emerging health problems in the bud, to result in better health for you as the patient, but also to result in lower costs of care for the healthcare system as a whole. So win-win. The problem is that these interventions themselves are expensive, so we have to target them to patients who need them the most. That's where algorithms come in. So we studied one commercial product that was being used to make screening decisions about high-risk care management for 70 million patients every year. If you look at the market estimates for similar algorithms, those are being used for basically the majority of the US population every year. So the scale of these algorithms is enormous. And here's how they all work. The goal is to find patients who are going to get sick. So I want to find patients that I can intervene on today to prevent them from getting sick tomorrow. And so what these algorithms do is they look into the future. They look to see who's going to generate a lot of healthcare costs from things like emergency visits and inpatient hospitalizations. And they predict that today so that we can find those patients and target them for high-risk care management now. So the goal of this is very laudable. We want the healthcare system to be more proactive, to find patients who are going to get sick, to not wait for them to come in. And so the task that these algorithms have been assigned is extremely good. The problem is that they were doing it in a biased way. So we were interested in studying racial bias. And here's how we thought about racial bias. People with the same score were being treated in the same way. So if you were in the top couple percent of the algorithm score, you were fast-tracked into the program at the health system that we studied. And in follow-on work, this is how they work at nearly every health system in the US and everyone that we've encountered. So patients are being treated the same. And so two patients with the same score should have the same need for high-risk care management. The color of their skin should not matter. But that's not actually what we found. So I'm sorry to show you a graph, but I'm going to show you a graph. And on this graph, the x-axis, the horizontal axis, shows people ordered by their algorithm risk score. So from low score at the left at 0 to very high score at the right. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you one measure of how those patients did in terms of their health over the year after the algorithm made its prediction. So here we're just counting up essentially a comorbidity score. So this is looking at if you had an exacerbation of your heart failure or your COPD and you had to go see a doctor, that was just +1, and we just added up all of those visits over the next year. And what we can see is that the purple line is Black patients, and the purple line is above the golden line, which is white patients, no matter where we are at the algorithm score. What does that mean? It means that at any algorithm score, Black patients do worse over that next year, even though they're being seen in the same way by the algorithm and they're being treated the same way as a result by the healthcare system. So here's, I think, a statistic that I found interesting, which is when we set out to measure how much bias, is this a lot of bias, is this a little bias, we looked at that high-risk group. So this is like the top 2-3% of patients that were prioritized for access to high-risk care management. And one statistic I can tell you is that to the right of that line in that purple box, the fast track, this high priority group, is 18% Black. That's the program as it was when we studied it. The base rate, the population rate of Black patients in this primary care population we studied was 12%. So a very reasonable way to look at the statistic is to say, oh, Black patients are overrepresented by 50% relative to what we would expect by random chance. So that must mean that the algorithm is not biased. It's doing a good job. It's getting even more Black patients into the program than we would have expected if it were just random. The problem is when we simulate it out based on people's healthcare needs, the fraction of that population that should have been Black, it should have been 47% Black if we just treated people proportional to their healthcare needs that emerged. So the representativeness guide to deciding whether something is biased or not, just looking at the fraction of the population, can be incredibly misleading because we don't know what the right number is. Is it random chance? Is it a little bit more, but not too much more than random chance? No, we have to look at what is the algorithm trying to do? What is the metric of need that we should be considering? And that's going to lead us to very different conclusions. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. When we were trying to understand where this algorithm went wrong, we looked at a very helpful statistic, which is where it went right. So now I'm showing you a similar graph with the algorithm score on the x-axis. But now on the y-axis, I'm showing you not how much health need those patients went on to have, but how much they went on to cost the medical system. And you can see that those two lines are exactly superimposed. So the algorithm is predicting cost very well, and it's doing it very well for Black patients and white patients alike with no bias for predicting cost. So even though there was this huge bias when we were looking at patients based on their health needs, there was no bias when we were looking at it based on the predicted cost. So why is that? Well, because Black and white patients don't have the same relationship between their health and costs. And that's the difference between needing healthcare and getting healthcare. White patients have better access to healthcare. So when they need healthcare, they're more likely to get it. And that means they are more likely to generate expenses when they need healthcare. In addition, the healthcare system just treats Black patients differently, and they end up getting referred to specialists less and getting advanced testing less. All of that leads to lower costs. And so that's why it's so important to look at the right metric, because at the same level of health, Black patients have lower costs, which means that if you train an algorithm to predict someone's cost, someone's future cost, you're going to be biased in prediction of their future health. And that's a huge problem when it comes to prioritizing people for access to this set of very helpful high-risk care management interventions. So let me close with some lessons from case study number 2. Just because a high priority group or any group looks diverse does not mean that there's no bias. And the lesson, once again here, is to really focus on the outcome variable. Use a measure of health needs, not health costs, to evaluate the algorithms. And that, critically for algorithms, is also the key to fixing the bias in them. So we worked with the company that made that software to retrain the algorithm in the same data set, so same representation of Black patients, we just predicted a different outcome that was related to health, not cost, and that resulted in 84% less bias. And we've since worked with a number of other healthcare systems, with insurers, with tech companies, and with federal and state regulators, where we found similar problems, but also similar solutions. So I mention this because focusing on that outcome variable is really the key to getting real-world evidence, all of our efforts in this area, as well as algorithms, to be tools for justice rather than tools to reinforce the status quo. Thank you.
Fantastic, Dr. Obermeyer. Really, I love the concreteness of the examples, because that really helps you understand a very difficult, issue around bias in data and bias in algorithms. Now, I want to remind folks that we now have 15 minutes for discussion on this topic. And I have some questions for Dr. Obermeyer, but please put yours in the chat. Oh, I see one's come up already, and we're going to get started. So let me turn to Jennifer's question. So years ago, a study showed that even in a primary care clinic in which Black older adults with OA, osteoarthritis, were likelier than white older adults with the same condition to have a knee arthroplasty recommended to them by their PCP. They were still even then, less likely to undergo knee surgery. Are these algorithms that have been developed are there algorithms that have been developed that can identify patients with hesitancy or mistrust and inform providers as to which interventions may help? So getting at that, even with the right algorithm or with the right recommendation, how do we identify those who might have mistrust or hesitancy? Ziad, any thoughts on some strategies there?
I think this is it's a question that gets at a number of very deep issues, and I'll tell you about one other example from the literature that I find really striking in this exact vein, which is one of my colleagues, Marcella Alsan, and her colleagues did a primary care randomized trial in Oakland, where they randomly assigned Black patients to either a Black primary care doctor or a white primary care doctor. And what they found was that at the end of a year, Black patients who were assigned to a Black doctor had far higher uptake of all sorts of recommended blood pressure screenings, but especially things that involved a needle, things that were invasive, blood sugar checks, vaccinations, things like that. So there is something about the doctor-patient relationship that is really broken, that we need to fix. Now, our work on knee pain suggests that that radiologists and doctors in general are not seeing causes of organic knee pain in Black patients. And so we can get more patients in the front door. But I don't think algorithms are necessarily going to help us with what to do once they get in the front door, because that's fundamentally about the human-to-human relationship between largely white doctors and Black patients. And so I think that, there's so much work that we need to do there. I think that, I know that there's some work going on using algorithms to look at the notes that doctors are writing and comparing the notes that they write about their Black patients versus their white patients, and trying to mine that for signs of like how they're thinking and how we can do better. But I think that ultimately all of those things can do for us are point us to ways that we can do better as humans, and the rest is up to us.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a very complex interaction. One thing that this audience may be interested in that gets to this issue of trust in the clinician-patient relationship is being tackled by the ABIM Foundation, where they're looking at this issue of trust and how do you build trust. Because if you look at the predictions of how long it's going to take to actually train a workforce, at a physician workforce, a practitioner workforce as diverse as our patients, it'll be 100 years practically. And so we cannot just, we're all have to do this better as clinicians in meeting patients' needs, whatever perspective or lived experience the patients come from. So I think that's critical. Okay, we have a few more questions. They're really nice and rich. Sylvia is asking, in what ways did AI or ML in developing the algorithms make a difference in detecting and defining the bias in the two use cases? So response to that, Ziad?
Yeah, I think the clearest example is maybe in the first one around X-rays. So, if you think about if you're a health services researcher or a clinical researcher, how do you think about an X-ray? So the typical way that we've put X-rays into our research is really by having humans look at the X-ray and grade them on various dimensions. So, you have a radiologist look and grade all of these very detailed metrics of arthritis. How else could you do it? You can't fit an X-ray into a traditional regression model as a set of explanatory variables, right? It's just like not a well-specified statistical task. So I think that's where machine learning is really, really helpful, is now we actually can cut that human out of the loop and really go directly from the organic things that we're seeing on the X-ray to clinical outcomes that matter. Now, I think hopefully one of the things that I was able to communicate is that the last thing we want to do is now put the human back in the loop by training the algorithm to spit back out what a human would say about the X-ray. That is the last thing we want to do. And so I think that for me is really the key. Machine learning provides this connection between these rich biological signals that we're getting from X-rays, from electrocardiograms, from MRIs, and allows us to look for interesting sources of signal that predict clinical outcomes and patient experiences that we care about. And so I think that's really the power of these algorithms. And I wanted to mention, especially since Lisa, you mentioned that AcademyHealth was doing this leadership around health data, is that with a number of my colleagues, I've set up a nonprofit called Nightingale Open Science that we're going to be launching later this year, where we work with health systems to build up exactly these data sets. So X-rays and ECGs and MRIs linked to patient outcomes. We build that up inside the healthcare system, and then we de-identify it, we take it out, we put it on our cloud platform and make it available to researchers in a secure way so that we're not the only people who can be doing this work. I think, when we talk about representativeness in data, we also need to talk about representativeness in researchers. So I'm extraordinarily lucky because I, have been at all these institutions that have access to healthcare data, and I can now go and ask people for data, but not everyone has that luxury. So we're really trying to democratize this research and make these data accessible to all the people who have really amazing ideas and want to do something with data, but don't today have access.
And I'm so glad you brought up that dimension of democratizing the investigator, the researcher, or access pool, because we're seeing more and more patients activated themselves and getting involved in research. And I think that really speaks to the importance of patient engagement at every step of the research life cycle, so to speak. And I think it's also, and PCORI has done a lot of work in helping to train patients and get them feeling, with the skills and tools to be able to effectively interact with researchers. I think we as a classically trained research community, we need to do a better job of how to effectively work with a more diverse research team, including patients. So lots of work to be done in this space, but great point. So,
yeah, and diverse in so many different ways, because I think, disciplinarily diverse, because computer scientists and statisticians can ask different kinds of questions than the ones that we're used to asking. And of course, diverse in terms of background, because people are just going to ask different and much more relevant questions. You often see this in like venture capital, where when the people who are investing in companies are all one kind of person, you end up getting companies that serve their needs with like butler apps and not things that are actually serving the poor and the disadvantaged. And so I think diversity at every level and on every dimension is so important.
Yeah, and to your example about apps, certainly women are very underrepresented in the startup community and the app community, and certainly that's been an issue for getting new applications that are women sensitive and women relevant as well. So let me turn to Isha Mehta's question, which is, for several disease areas, published validated algorithms heavily rely on certain medications as a proxy for diagnosis. This can inherently introduce ethno-racial biases. What, if anything, can be done to combat this?
This is a great point, and I think it speaks to a much broader point, which is that we often use as proxies healthcare rather than health. And it seems, like a natural thing to do, because like, what else could you do? We use, we see a lot of, for example, algorithms that are predicting a diagnosis. But what does a diagnosis mean? It means an ICD code that shows up in a financial transaction between a healthcare system and an insurer. So of course, once you put it that way, you see that like, oh, so someone who has diabetes and never gets diagnosed is not going to show up. Similarly, to Isha's question, someone who has a disease and isn't put on a medication by a doctor because the doctor doesn't take the symptoms seriously, because the doctor doesn't think the patient can afford it, doesn't think the patient's going to be adherent to the medication, that person's experience, their disease is never going to show up. And so I think this is a really general mechanism of bias where we conflate getting healthcare with needing healthcare. And I think that's exactly what we saw in our study, where we saw these differences in cost. And I'll point out that how did we fix that? Well, we actually didn't. We did better because we were using diagnoses, but we were still depending on someone getting a diagnosis from a doctor. And so, I think there's a lot more work to do on really getting deeper into how we go direct to the patient and how we collect that information directly from the patient. And I think that I'm actually very optimistic, for example, about wearables, because that lets us cut the doctor and the healthcare system out of the loop. And of course, they're expensive now, but they're going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper. And so I think that's a very promising avenue, because it lets us go directly to the patient and not depend on the patient needing to be seen and cared for by someone else.
No, great points, Ziad, and it really just underscores the importance of the whole investment in developing more reliable patient-reported outcome measures. And once they're developed, getting them used and getting data and getting patients engaged in every step of that. And the FDA's patient-focused drug development, all these are moves in the right direction. It's just personally, progress is there, but it's slow. And I think your presentation just underscores how important this is, that we need to get the patient voice captured in more reliable ways without that intermediary of the clinician interaction.
And I think that there's this, one of the reasons that I think it hasn't been prioritized is because people tend to think about these things like pain scores as like, oh, they're so noisy, it's like, is it really their knee, or is it just that they woke up on the wrong side of bed in the morning? And the more work that I do in this area, the more I see that there's enormous amount of signal in these data, and we should be taking it very seriously. We had another paper on how every person has their own individual temperature baseline. So yours and mine might be very different. In the hospital, as I'm sure you remember, when patients come in and they say, oh, this is a fever for me, my temperature runs low, doctors really roll their eyes, but it turns out that's true. They do it so the more we look into the data, the more we see that patients are actually right and doctors are wrong, and we just haven't seen it because we haven't seen the data. And so I think these new data sets and new tools are really going to help us take patients much more seriously and see the value in the data that they've been giving us for centuries.
Great. Well, we have four more questions. I'm going to skip one, which is specific to radiology, and take some of the broader ones first. We'll see if we can get to all of them. So great presentation from comment from Kevin Fahy. In addition to using evidence to identify additional characteristics of experiencing a condition such as knee pain, you also see the potential for identifying additional options for treatment based on using similar evidence. For example, could there be another treatment for knee pain other than replacement surgery and or medication for pain? So this gets really at the range of treatment options. And certainly, again, my experience when I was in my initial clinical cascade as a patient, this was a while ago, so not much data informed my decision making, but even having information on pros and cons and survival advantage of, tamoxifen versus not, chemo versus not, et cetera. It's just so critical at every step. And it's those trade-offs. And then we bring our own values and risk preferences to the table. So how are we going to use this kind of approach to help with that?
I think, there's a way in which algorithms can tell us one very focused thing. So in our example, it's like, are there people that radiologists are under triaging that we should be triaging up in terms of the severity of their disease? So in a sense, there's this way in which algorithms are a little unsatisfying because they just provide us this one very targeted answer to one question. But I think the way I'm increasingly coming to view them is as tools. So now that we know that there are all of these patients that we're missing causes of knee pain in, what do we do with that? So to Kevin's question, can we put them down alternate pathways? Can we? So all great questions. First, we need to know, what is it? So what we're trying to do now is build up more of these data sets and try to figure out what is going on in those knees. So we can look at the MRIs that some of these patients got and say, okay, what is in the MRI that radiologists are not seeing disproportionately in Black patients, x-rays. We can show those x-rays to radiologists and say, what looks different about this one than this one in an open-ended way. So I think using these kinds of insights from data and plugging them back into our standard process for doing science, for doing clinical research is going to be tremendously valuable. And so from that point of view, the algorithms are just, it's like kind of an x-ray for the x-ray. It's just a tool that we can apply to the data that will help us humans derive more of exactly these kinds of insights from the data.
So we're at time, but I want to throw you a last final question. Given our audience, given the National Health Council, any final words of advice of what patient advocacy, voluntary health associations can be doing to engage in this and push for, to both support, what do patients do with this information?
I think for me, a lot of my work is about trying to take a balanced view of what we can do with data. So I'm incredibly optimistic about what algorithms and real world evidence can do. I'm also very attuned to the harms from racial biases and other things. And so I think that the way that these choices are often presented to us is like, well, do you care about privacy? And do you care about big evil corporations not doing bad stuff with your data? It's like, yeah, I don't want that. But on the other hand, we also need to be attuned to the enormous amount of good that these data can do for patients by exposing and surfacing these kinds of biases in the ways that doctors are treating them. So I think that for me, the most important thing that I try to do in my own work is to try to really take that balanced perspective. And when we're thinking about how we influence regulators, how we allow our data to be used, remember that there are really bad things that can happen, but there are also really great things that can happen. And in a way, we're a little bit biased because the bad things are very concrete. Breaches to privacy, all of these things, we can imagine them. Can we imagine the research insights that were never produced because nobody got to touch the data? They're a lot harder to imagine. And so we're just intrinsically attuned to the downsides, to the losses rather than the gains. And so I think that's maybe, if I could influence the way that the debate is going in one way or another, as I know that patient groups can, that's probably where I'd focus, is on that nuanced view.
Terrific. Well, Dr. Obermeyer, Ziad, thank you so much for this great conversation, great presentation. To our audience, please, if you'd like to learn more or get involved on any ongoing initiatives about this topic, about data and diversity, this intersection, please visit the National Health Council's website to learn more on their work on health equity in partnership with the National Minority Quality Forum. And there will be a series of health equity roundtables hosted by their Health Equity Task Force coming up, and they will be developing policy recommendations and member-facing activities. And similarly, AcademyHealth is going to be releasing a report this June with a set of recommendations. So stay tuned for more. It's a really important priority, and we're so glad you joined us, and especially Ziad, Dr. Obermeyer, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. This was so much fun. Great to see you.